Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Zuzanna Quadera. I am a research assistant and program administrator here at the IISS, and I am part of the Missile Dialogue Initiative. It's my pleasure to be chairing today's conversation, and this webinar is a launch event for a recent research paper that one of our speakers today, Camille Grant, wrote for the MDI, titled Missiles, Deterrence and Arms Control, Options for a New Era in Europe. I'm very glad that we were able to publish this paper, to bring it to you, and to convene this discussion today at a time where when Europe wakes up to a very different security environment than that of even just a decade ago. It is a security environment in which the arms control architecture of the past is all but gone. We obviously have also seen the return of armed conflict into the region with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And so now is a crucial time for NATO allies to, as Camille put it in his paper, relearn the grammar of deterrence and really just have the conversation about the capabilities that Europe needs to deter adversaries and to defend itself. But also it's a conversation about what role arms control as a security tool could play to ensure strategic stability in the region. It's really an excellent report that ties together some of the key debates among the alliance. We have two fantastic speakers with us today. We have the author of the paper, Camille Grant. Camille is a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he leads their work on defense and disruptive technologies in European security. Previously, Camille worked as Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO between 2016 and 2022. Where he led the alliance's work in capability delivery, missile defense, and armament and technology cooperation. We also have Douglas Barry, who is a senior fellow for military aerospace here at the IISS, where he is responsible for ensuring the quality of the military aerospace analysis and the information on air power capabilities that are presented in our flagship publication, which is the Military Balance. Among many other responsibilities, Doug is also part of the Missile Dialogue Initiative team. Doug previously worked at defense and security publications, including Aviation Week and Space Technology, Defense News, Flight International, and Jane's Defense Weekly. Before we begin, let me just quickly go over some ground rules. Camille will speak first for about 15 minutes or so, and then Doug will come in as a discussant and deliver remarks of about 10 minutes. The rest of our hour together will be spent on a Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. The icon of the Q&A should be just in the middle of the toolbar that you can see on the bottom of your screens. And I'll then read out those questions to our speakers, and they will have the opportunity to answer. With that, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you, Camille.
Thank you very much, Susanna, and thank you for having me on this webinar. It's really been a great pleasure to prepare this paper for the IISS and to work with the excellent team of the Missile Dialogue Initiative, which also contributed greatly to the quality of the paper and provided some really fantastic support. Of course, many of our listeners will want to take a look at the paper, and I certainly encourage them to do so. So I'm not going to sort of read through the paper, which is a bit too long for that purpose, and you would probably cut me if I tried to do so. But more maybe highlight a few points that I find important to launch our conversation on this issue of missiles, deterrence, and arms control in Europe in today's environment. The ambition of the paper was a bit broad because it tried to bring together multiple strands of the conversation that are deeply connected, although they tend to be addressed separately in different formats. So from that perspective, I think my attempt was really to try to bring the deterrence, including nuclear deterrence conversation, with the missile conversation, with the arms control conversation in a single paper, because I really strongly believe that these need to be connected, and that having the conversations in separate formats fails to address the challenges of today's environment. Let me start with the environment. Obviously, the starting point is the sort of radical transformation of the European security environment. No need for such an informed audience as ISS audiences to describe what the events in Ukraine of the last 20 months. But I think more broadly, it is important to stress that many of the features that were framing our environment, including in the missile domain, have disappeared. A web of treaties have been either violated or are no longer in place, starting with the INF Treaty. And we see a sort of arms race logic prevailing over the arms control logic, which was dominant from the late 80s until, let's say, the late 2010, one could say, or late 2000 if you want to start from the moment where Vladimir Putin started criticizing this post-Cold War security and arms control environment. So the key there is, and that's really a decision by Russia, by turning its back on the logic of control constraints and entering the production of a new generation of missiles, including of European ranges. We are really entered a very different environment, and it's really important to get this when addressing this, because if we start from the assumption that things haven't changed or that we are broadly in the same environment from a technological standpoint, from political standpoint, from a legal standpoint, we fail to address it. Of course, the technological landscape, and Doug is one of the most prominent experts on that, is also changing quite rapidly. There is an evolution of the missiles deployed or under development in terms of range, speed, stealthiness, types, which is creating also a security environment which is quite different, with the fielding of new disruptive capabilities that were either not covered by treaties or not thought as feasible. So hypersonic technology is one of them, but it's not the only issue. And I would stress that what's interesting is that a large portion of this new portfolio of missile technology has been used in Ukraine quite extensively, and I can only recommend a paper written by the ISS team on this particular issue with the use of missiles in Russia's war in Ukraine. Second, there are also a blurring of the lines between missile technology and other technologies that allow deep precision strike. So there, long-range artillery, drones, which certainly also further complicates the conversation on this, because even assuming there could be a cap on missile, there are lots of alternatives available. Thirdly, that creates a seen from a NATO or a national perspective, a very big shock on our core policies that are, let's say, to put it gently, challenged or questioned. And maybe the answer is they should remain the same, but fundamentally are questioned. Because we are in this new environment. Arms control, obviously, in a situation where arms control is the toolbox that was developed at the end of the Cold War is no longer in place. Missile defense, where there is a reinvestment in air and missile defense capabilities by a number of European countries. When that was a capability that was often seen as secondary during most of the post-Cold War era. And deterrence itself, with a conversation on the balance between conventional means of deterrence and nuclear means, what the NATO jargon calls the appropriate mix between conventional nuclear and missile defense. All of these things are really there. Last element of the transformation is really the issue of the fact that, and that's something that I didn't develop as much in the paper, but I think is really important, is the fact that we cannot see this in a Eurocentric approach. A lot of these developments are driven by developments in the Indo-Pacific, by the developments of technology, by a number of players in that particular region. And I would argue that not only the US policy, but even the Russian policy is probably influenced by those developments there, and we need to really think through this. So where does that leave us in Europe? What could be a sort of three-track approach? First of all, obviously, there are lots of moving pieces. There is a war going on the European continent, so a lot of this might take a lot of time to develop. There are still conversations ongoing at NATO, elsewhere, on what is the right track. So I guess the first track is would be the sort of bringing back nuclear deterrence at the forefront of our conversation, which is critical to avoid escalation. It did work, and I think this is something that we should stress, and in the context of the war in Ukraine. You know, I disagree with the statement that it's a failure of deterrence, because of course deterrence did work in not having this, not facing a form of horizontal escalation, and to a certain degree a form of vertical escalations by the use of nuclear weapons so far. So there is a need to really have a right signal, what I indeed call the relearning the grammar of deterrence, having a long-term commitment to the deterrent, including its nuclear component. And there is an interesting element, which is, of course, as I hinted at, there is a need. There is an open question on the need to change the nuclear posture. You know, should there be land-based capabilities in Europe? We are not quite there yet, but the US is developing such capabilities of land-based cruise missiles, whether they would be nuclear or conventional. That is which would have been prohibited under the INF Treaty. The deployment of such systems in Europe would be a massive shift. We don't see them yet, but there is an interesting conversation on whether we need to do much more. Second element is the more symmetrical responses to Russia's missile and nuclear development. I think the NATO countries have made a very deliberate decision not to mirror Russian policy, which I think is a wise decision. But the issue is, are there specific developments that make sense to be able to counter this over-reliance on novel missile capabilities by Russia? Are there, so first in the realm of missile defense, Germany has been promoting this European Sky Shield initiative, which tries to aggregate demand of air and missile defense technology by inviting others to join Germany in joint procurement of such capabilities. The French, for their part, have been arguing for a more strategic conversation, and that has been at the core of the message from President Macron himself on this over time. We can come back to that in the Q&A. There is a conventional dimension. I mean, do we need deep precision strike capabilities? Do we need more ISR capabilities? I mean, all of these things are going to be quite critical, and the issue there is really to have a robust thing. Last but not least, the arms control dimension of all of this. So at first, many of our listeners might say, is it really time for arms control? How can we do arms control as Russia is waging a war in Ukraine? And I would tend to agree with them for today. Obviously, it is a bit odd to be thinking of arms control proposal in a moment that for the Ukrainians might look very much like 1942 or where it is we're in the middle of a major conflict. But I would argue that arms control is neither dovish or hawkish. It depends on how you draft your proposals. But I think the time is right, and I try to do this in the paper to share some basic principles that will guide our thinking on this. Number one, this is not about going back to a pre-existing treaty. We have to really understand how the world has changed. Second, this is about improving security. So that's a way of, in a way, going back to the traditional approach to arms control. It's not a matter of moral high ground or achieving disarmament. This is really a tool to improve our collective security as Europe, as NATO. And in order to do so, to sort of weigh arms control tools versus more military tools, for instance. So it's really one set of cards in the deck of cards, not a standalone process that is there. And from that perspective, I think we need to, a good way to start thinking about this, even though it would probably take a different form, is to go back to the famous Helmut Schmidt speech in London at Arundel House in the IISS in 1977, which triggered in 1977, which triggered the NATO dual track decision of 79, which essentially said in response to the SS-20 deployment by the Soviet Union, we need to be both able to offer an arms control track, but also be ready to take all necessary measures to counter those new developments. Again, the point is not to cut and paste that approach, but to think in those terms of really think really strategic. So let me conclude by a few last remarks. It's important in the environment we're in to not exclude anything. You know, I'm slightly worried when I hear Western leaders commenting on a lot of these developments by saying we will not do X, Y, or Z. I think it's important to not rule out options there. Second, I would argue that deterrence and arms control are mutually supportive. And third, that integrated deterrence and a robust posture for NATO does involve a nuclear component, a conventional component, a missile defense component that can be mutually supportive and that are probably quite a different mix from the traditional one. So I think it is very important that the Europeans think through this with our American allies, and try to come up with some robust ideas and policies, both in terms of capability development, of strategic thinking, and eventually of legal constraints when the time is right. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the conversation and starting with the Duke's challenges, I hope.
Thank you very much, Camille. You covered a lot of ground as you do in your paper. Thank you so much for just sort of weaving those, separate but very interdependent conversations together and making a very compelling case for thinking holistically about NATO defense and deterrence. I've got plenty of questions, but before that, we're going to hear from Doug now.
Thanks, Susanna. And first of all, thank you, Camille, for what I think is a paper I struggle to recommend highly enough. I think it's a really, really good piece of work. I'll add a little more comment with regards to land attack cruise missiles in particular and some related capabilities. Very briefly look at some of the implications in terms of conventional and, if you will, theatre nuclear deterrence. I think as Camille's paper so eloquently illustrates, the European security environment has been both challenged and changed by Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And Moscow's failed to meet any of its goals in an ill-conceived and poorly executed campaign. But its war is also offering lessons to Russia's military and to the alliance. I'll briefly look at what Moscow's used in terms of land attack missiles, what lessons may be drawn from this use, and possible implications for NATO, along with the usual caveat in terms of we only have partial information on Russia's war, figures are very hard to come by, etc. In terms of the weapons we've seen used, the initial strikes used the Raduga Ka-101, an air-launched land attack cruise missile that we first saw used in Syria. There are indications that at least at first there were problems regarding the use of this missile. We saw failure rates which seemed to be far higher than you would have expected to see, certainly from a comparable Western style cruise missile in this class. Launch platforms obviously were the Tu-95 MS, the Bear-H, and the Tu-160 Blackjack. The other primary land attack cruise missile that we saw used at the outset of the campaign was a naval cruise missile at the Novator 3M14 caliber. The initial strikes, interestingly, used comparatively few numbers of land attack cruise missiles, at least per target. There also seemed to be a pretty poor battle damage assessment, and if you like, a failure to sustain these attacks, and along with kind of tracking some of the targets that were relocatable. And as Camille mentioned, there is a concern, an area around intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, both in terms of NATO capacity, but certainly in terms of what the Russians themselves have got. Furthermore, I think it flagged up an issue in terms of inventory depth on both the Ka-101 and the 3M14. The Russians, from their perspective, clearly haven't got enough of these. And furthermore, industry's been unable to kind of sustain production rates to rapidly restock to pre-invasion levels. In that sense, what we then saw was that, you know, the initial failure of the campaign and a kind of resulting attritional conflict has forced the Russians to kind of press into use systems that really weren't particularly suitable for the land attack role. In particular, the Raduga Ka-22, which is initially was designed as an anti-ship missile, a large anti-ship missile, entered service at the end of the 1960s, and really is poorly suited for the land attack role. But it kind of flags up Moscow's far lesser concern for collateral damage and civilian casualties. What we've also seen in far smaller numbers, although obviously of interest, with the use of the Kinjal, which is an air-launched aeroballistic missile. It's carried by a modified MiG-31, the Foxhound D, and the missile itself is a version of the 9M723, which is a short-range ground-launched ballistic missile, the NATO name SS-26 Stone. We've also seen a modified Raduga Ka-55. This is the predecessor to the Ka-102, with the nuclear package removed. Obviously, it's been used as a decoy. There's also been a suggestion that the conventional variant, the Ka-55, the Ka-555, has been used, but so far we've seen no imagery evidence to support this. And there's certainly a line of thought that says, actually, the number of missiles converted was comparatively small, and most, if not all, of these were used in the campaign in Syria. Other systems that have appeared occasionally, MPO Messina Stroinia's 3M55, it's a coastal defence cruise missile, again used in a land attack role, and ground-launched cruise missiles. So the Novator 9M728 has probably been used. And it also raises a question of whether or not the 9M729, which is a longer range variant of the 728, has also been at least tested. Although again, there's nothing in open source to confirm this. Now, obviously, the 729 was the missile which was one of the key systems which resulted in the US withdrawal from the INF Treaty. So if you look at the lack of inventory depth, one of the things that the Russians have done is supplemented this capability, as Camille alluded to, by the use of some other systems, in particular turning to Iran to get the Shahed family of what we style direct attack munitions. You'll sometimes see them referred to as one-way attack UAVs. Obviously far slower than a turbofan powered cruise missile. It's probably only got a 40 kilogram warhead, which is, at least we would imagine, an order of magnitude smaller than a Ka-101 warhead. But it's also more than an order of magnitude less expensive and can be produced far more quickly. It's being used by the Russians to stress Ukrainian air defense, to make the Ukrainians burn through their inventory of interceptors, and simply to compound the challenge for the defender. And furthermore, these systems, the Shahed, Garan, as it's styled in Russia, is fire in ripples or waves. So what might the Russians draw from any kind of post-war analysis? I think, first of all, that its air campaign was ineffective in terms of deep interdiction. Its initial use of land attack cruise missiles was piecemeal. It clearly lacked sufficient inventory depth. Furthermore, subsonic land attack cruise missiles may be increasingly vulnerable to well-orchestrated air defense, ground-based air defense. And I think obviously there is a spillover in this area in terms of the implications for Russian theatre nuclear systems. As I mentioned, low-cost direct attack munitions, the Shahed-style weapon, obviously has considerable utility if acquired in numbers. And we're already seeing some of this reflected in some of the Russian military writing, which is kind of beginning to discuss some of the things that they're drawing from the failures in particular in the war. Now, there's also a greater emphasis in higher speed weapons, as Camille mentioned, the hypersonic arena. Moscow, we think, already has two, or at least two, near Mach 5 or Mach 5 plus tactical cruise missile programs underway. One associated with the names Gremlin and Lychenka, the other associated with the name Ostrota. Both, we think, are probably Mach 5 plus weapons. Gremlin or Lychenka is a 1,500 kilometer range air-launched weapon. Ostrota may have a slightly smaller range. It's intended to be carried by tactical fighters as well as heavy bombers. And also, in the subsonic arena, the Russians haven't stopped developments in this area. We've seen recent reference to the Ka-BD program, BD standing for long range in Russian. This is most likely a development of the Ka-101, 102, but the aim being to push out the range to 6,500 kilometers. So that's an even longer range variant of the 101, 102. What does this mean for NATO? Well, as Camille mentioned, in terms of integrated air and missile defence, there was a kind of period of benign neglect in many ways in the 1990s and 2000s. There really wasn't a conventional air and missile threat to Europe in many ways. And in terms of BMD, ballistic missile defence, NATO BMD was limited to addressing threats from outside the Euro-Atlantic area. You know, clearly this has now changed. And by implication, we're already seeing this. There's more focus on integrated air and missile defence. And I think there's an interesting question around the extent of the ambition, certainly on ballistic missile defence. And again, as Camille mentioned, we're seeing the emergence of kind of two competing visions within Europe. The European Sky Shield initiative out of Germany, and France's vision of perhaps a more Eurocentric view. I mean, irrespective of the fact that these are competing visions, I think what's important here is the renewed focus. There's a recognition that there needs to be more done in this area. Finally, in terms of NATO response, and again, as Camille touched on, integrated air and missile defence also has an offensive element. So in many ways, the best way to deal with a missile threat is to deal with it before its launch. But obviously that means you've got to be able to go after it on the ground. NATO faces a kind of 360-degree threat. I would expect we're going to inevitably see likely a greater mix of in-atmosphere threat systems across a much broader speed range, you know, from the kind of Garan style 150 kilometers per hour, 2,000, 2,500 kilometer range class weapons, to systems which are Mach 5 and considerably above. And as such, unfortunately, in a sense, the integrated air and missile defence challenge for the alliance is only going to become greater. And with that, Zuzanna, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you for this overview of the ways in which Russia used missiles and direct attack munitions in Ukraine, and the ways in which it, in many cases, failed to use them effectively, but also what lessons they're drawing from them for both their current inventories, but also future missile developments. I'm going to abuse my chair privilege and start us up with a question about, well, so many commentators these days, they compare this current moment to that of the late 1970s, as you mentioned, before the dual track decision from NATO. And I wanted to ask you about what differences there are between the current environment and that of the 1970s, late 1970s, 1980s, that made the negotiation and conclusion of the INF Treaty possible. And also, what do you think we can learn from that? But more importantly, what we shouldn't learn from that? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take that one, and I'm sure Duke might want to chip in. I think first of all, we have an open war where missiles are being shot every day, which is a slightly, more than slight difference. It's a massive difference, and which makes the whole process of trying to think arms control in a sort of grand strategy, great power, managed competition way much more difficult. So that's a crucial difference. Second, as I mentioned, the Eurocentric approach is impossible. It was already complicated in the 80s when INF was negotiated. At a certain point, the Japanese and other US allies in Asia Pacific woke up and said, well, by the way, this is not about moving all the Soviet gear to Siberia, right? So here it's even worse in a way, because the dynamic is trilateral when it comes to missiles with China, making things much more complicated for certainly America, possibly Russia, to sort of think through what systems they are ready to control, and so on. So the bottom line is, in a way, it was much simpler in the 70s and 80s, because it was essentially a bilateral issue, so sort of US-Soviet conversation, essentially a European issue, and in peacetime, even though it was a time of high arms race and competition for parts of the period. So altogether, the issue was how to design an arms control. The challenge was the same: how to design an arms control tool that creates confidence, that provides additional security. The challenge is the same. But the realities, the political realities and military realities under which we are discussing are quite different. I would add the last one, maybe, which is of course critical, is that most of the missiles, or quasi all of the missiles we were talking about then, were nuclear tipped, when now a lot of the missiles you would want to try and catch in a regime are conventional. So that's a further difference.
Thank you very much. And I think for both of you, a question from a couple of participants concerning some of the recent arms control proposals and where they are now. So one is about Russia's INF moratorium, or rather a ban plus 9M729 and verification proposal. So Pavel Podbig asks that it appears to still be on the table, and if it is indeed, is there any interest in it? And then Alexander Grave asked, do you believe it will be useful or possible to come back to the offer in the US response to the Russian 2021 draft treaty concerning reciprocal transparency measures at missile sites, so aegis ashore and in Russian missile bases? Thank you.
Let me maybe start with Pavel's question. Honestly, I think the proposal, the Russian proposal for a moratorium, is very difficult to be a sound base for an engagement as of today. I mean, partially because of the war in Ukraine, obviously, partially also because there are a number of questions that were valid at the moment this proposal was made and led to criticism by a number of countries that remain, even if the war in Ukraine was not ongoing. So the general idea that some sort of that the moratorium could be part of the conversation is not absurd, but I don't think the Russian proposal, as it was formulated a couple of years ago, is today really in the cards, and I'm not even sure Russia would formally support it if given an opportunity. So that's to Pavel, but again, I think it is important to keep that proposal in mind when trying to think about the future, but not so much as a basis for a conversation. With regard to Alexander's point and the issue of how do we, the way I would rephrase it a little bit is, can we expand the conversation? And I think it's necessary. It's not going to be simple nor easy to have when the moment is right, and we're not there once again, to have an arms control conversation that ignores unmanned systems, that ignores missile defenses. So at a certain point, the fact that it would be a broader conversation, and from that perspective, indeed, the CFE precedent is interesting, that would try to cap arsenals and so on, could be indeed a smarter approach to the problem, rather than having a simple focus on one or two missile types of a certain range.
Thank you very much. Anything to add, Doug?
Yeah, just very briefly on Pavel's. I think probably the start point for this, again, it depends on your position, is Moscow being open about the actual range of the 9M729. So obviously there is still a difference of opinion, shall we say, between the US, its alliance partners, and Moscow in the range of that weapon. The Russians, up until now, have insisted it doesn't breach the treaty. NATO remains convinced that it does. So I think for the moratorium to have any chance at all, there first has to be a bit of openness and honesty from Moscow on that weapon, and until you get to that point, I think it just isn't going to have much traction. On the kind of more broad arms control environment, the one thing I would add is that you need absolutely top level political will to engage, which the 1980s started very, very badly in this sense, but perhaps rather curiously, given the two primary actors, they did actually manage to push forward. And I think until you have a kind of similar environment between the main participants, it's going to be very, very difficult. That's not to say you don't try, because you obviously do, but nothing is going to happen in a hurry.
Thank you, Doug. Camille, you mentioned in the paper that, on arms control, it is not an expectation that Russia will turn into a like-minded country. It still may be an adversary, but arms control is a sensible thing to do with an adversary. So I was just wondering, while we're on arms control, if you could elaborate a little bit on the necessary preconditions for restarting negotiation, but also about verification, how it's going to work in the future, having already been burned by the experience with various previous treaties.
Well, I mean, first, you do arms control with adversaries or competitors or potential competitors. You rarely do it with your friends and allies. You know, I'm not aware of a current existing arms control between France and Britain trying to cap our respective nuclear arsenals or missile stockpiles. So, I mean, one of the purposes of arms control is to work with foes, to put it simply, with partners that you eventually distrust and with whom you are, you know, in at least a competition and possibly in a more adversarial relationship. And you know, it was invented during the Cold War to manage an adversarial relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. So that remains valid. So from that perspective, I would counter the argument of saying, you know, we can do arms control only when Russia is a friendly democracy or when China has joined the club of Western countries. That won't happen. And if those good things happen, probably won't need arms control to manage the relationship. So, having said this, of course, the fact that there is a war ongoing, as I mentioned in the original presentation, and a war in which both sides believe they are rather in the middle of the war than close to an end, you start thinking makes it extraordinarily difficult to move forward now. But if we start thinking about what it could look like, it is important. And from that perspective, I think the key element is that, first of all, you know, arms control is one of the post-war tools usually. So what is it that we would like to see that could be reassuring for the Ukrainians, reassuring for Europe in a post-war environment? Number one. Number two, are we ready to engage in a conversation with a post-war Russia, whatever it looks like, and accept some constraints on our own posture in order to extract from Russia more transparency as a minimum, and possibly some further constraints and reductions. So that is the sort of mindset you need to approach, and then again, in a nutshell, the conditions are not there as we speak. But I think it shouldn't prevent us from thinking about what we would have. And I always argue, and I'll close on this, that it is important to start with what would be our ideal environment. What is it that we, you know, if we were not negotiating with anyone, what would we like to stop Russia from having? And that should be our starting position. And then up to the Russians to explain what is it that they would like to see part of the basket when the moment for deeper conversations is right.
Thank you, Doug. That's great. Thank you for this. Speaking of the environment, Carl Dewey at IISS has a question about Russia's talk of de-ratifying the CTBT. And that, you know, is designed to indicate that it's preparing to conduct a nuclear test. What damage would a Russian nuclear test do to testing norms? And will the US ratify the CTBT? Doug, why don't you start us off?
What damage would it do? I imagine the damage would be considerable. In terms of, you know, normative behaviour, this is absolutely what you don't want to see. As for the second part of the question, I think I'll leave that for Camille. Sorry, Camille.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, I, you know, first of all, the Russian announcement is appalling. There is no reason whatsoever that justifies such a decision. I mean, Russians, including Russians with whom I got it, Russian officials with whom I got into a Twitter fight over this over the last few days, argue that, of course, since the US, and I would argue China, have not ratified the CTBT, unratifying it is leveling the playing field for Russia. I think this is not fair. I think the reality is that nobody but Russia is thinking of testing nuclear weapons today. I think the environment is not one that justifies reversing a ratification or a signature of the CTBT. Yes, indeed, the fact that the United States, China, but also India, Pakistan, and the DPRK have not ratified the CTBT is a real problem. But I would not necessarily recommend that we should reverse previous policies of very, very heavy restraint on nuclear policy. What worries me, honestly, with the Russian policy is the fact that usually when the Russian leadership starts picking on a treaty, a few years after, the treaty is violated. We've seen that with CFE, we've seen that to a degree with INF. So we don't want that to happen with the CTBT. And then coming to the US, as you know, the ratification of the CTBT was defeated in the Congress, in the Senate in '99, was a big blow to the arms control community and the efforts of the Clinton administration to secure this. The reality is that probably Congress is even more divided today over such issues. I think the Russian move is only fueling those minority voices in the US that prefer not to rule out anything, and is clearly killing any chances of at some point moving forward with the ratification of the CTBT in Washington under a different political environment.
A question to Camille from Van Sperstrate. You mentioned the possibility of a theater-level posture change, for example, ground-launched cruise missiles. What would be an ideal mix of theater weapon system look like in Europe? No, a very easy question.
Doug might have his own view. I think the question there is, I think it's a bit tricky. I think my bottom line is to say we don't need to do a tit for tat vis-a-vis Russia. We are NATO allies, have a different skill set and a different. So the point is not to engage into an arms race that would mirror the Russian posture and try to field as many ballistic and land attack cruise missiles or ground launch cruise missiles as possible. Having said this, I think the key issue is a bit twofold. Is to try to think through a mix, which and this is often forgotten, would have a very strong joint ISR component, so strengthening our intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. It is really, really important to understand better the nature of the threat and be able to counter it. Second, Europeans will probably tend, and that's part of the ESSI approach, to put a bit of focus on defensive capabilities, because they will see it as important to protect critical infrastructure, critical military facilities, but also our population based on the experience of Ukraine. Thirdly, there is a dimension of a deep precision strike capability. And there the challenge is to know whether the existing capabilities, the Storm Shadow, Scalp family, the successor, the Taurus, the ATACMS, the US capabilities embark on the F-35. I mean, do these meet the requirement that we need in terms of the precision strike capabilities conventional to pose a dilemmas to the adversary and create a sufficient degree of constraints? And finally, and that's probably the most divisive issue, does the NATO nuclear deterrent, can it continue to rely solely on the B-61 stroke 12, which is an airdropped, sophisticated, but still an airdropped bomb, and does the stealthiness of the new dual-capable aircraft carrying that mission, and that soon will be carrying the mission all over Europe, which is the F-35, does that suffice? Or do we want to add, beyond the strategic capabilities of the three nuclear allies, additional assets to that. I don't think we're there yet, but there is a push by certain allies. You all remember President Duda saying it would be great to have land-based nuclear capabilities in Europe and so on. So I think that push that is very Polish specific for the moment might expand to other allies if the situation, the security environment continues to deteriorate.
On the missile defense front, Carl Dew is asking, how does the European Sky Shield initiative fit into NATO air and missile defense policy? And also about the recent purchase of the Arrow 3 systems in Germany that are designed to intercept exo-atmospheric systems. What threats is Germany looking to defend against by purchasing those systems?
Well, Carl's question is spot on. The first part of the question is that ESSI is meant to build additional capability across NATO allies. There are a number of allies that have signed up to be part of this conversation, and some of them that are already committed to buy under a German umbrella, either IRIS-T or PAC-3s. And that is consistent with NATO posture, NATO policy, and that will build up the capabilities that we have over time. It is not a NATO joint acquisition. It is a framework nation concept, as we say in the NATO environment, with a lead nation aggregating demand and doing this, and this is consistent. The Arrow 3 is a bit of a different animal, honestly. First of all, the nature and the Israeli-American system makes it probably more difficult to integrate in a NATO C2, and that's going to be a challenge. And second, as Carl's questions points, it's a very expensive missile for a threat that doesn't really exist as of today. Unless we want to frame the entire NATO ballistic missile defense architecture around Shahab 3s and the Iranian threat. Even the Russians don't really feel the system that would fall into this category. So I'm very eager to hear Doug's analysis of that. But my initial feeling is it's a bit of an odd choice of a missile, of a capability that might be very capable, but it is not focused on the type of threats that are the priority threats for Europe.
So I was just obviously, Camille's point about, what is this system actually intended to address in terms of what's the target set for the Arrow 3 in a European context. I think we are all scratching our heads a little bit about this, because if you look at the Russian inventory, there's nothing that springs out that says, this is absolutely what we want the Arrow 3 for. So whether there is a strong political element to this acquisition, I think is certainly an open question, given the relationship between Germany and Israel in certain areas. More generally on ESSI, I think the point about it being a kind of framework approach makes sense, in that it's simply, it foregrounds the need for more capability. Exactly how you go about addressing this is at a national level a question, but obviously it's important that whatever gets acquired at the national level, at the domestic level, fits into the NATO architecture, the emerging architecture, and the greater NATO requirement to be able to handle these the emerging threat systems. Where Arrow sits, or Arrow 3 in particular sits in this, I think we've yet to see how it would fit in. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Question to both of you from Gregory Giles. Could you please elaborate on NATO lessons learned are seen from the war in Ukraine for tracking Russian tells and other types of missile launchers? Doug, why don't you start us off?
I'll start and then I'll hand over to Camille. I think one of the things that Camille mentioned, that one of the lessons, if you like, it's emerging for the alliance out of the Russia's war in Ukraine is how important intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is at all levels, from the geospatial down to airborne systems. Very long-running and arguably very painful procurement for NATO was the Alliance Ground Surveillance, NATO AGS, which is, it's almost a 30-year program from bank to flash in some ways. But it's really proved or shown its value both in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, to Russia's full-blown invasion, and then since. The consideration of the concern there is that obviously it's it's 5 RQ-4D Phoenix derivatives, so the Global Hawk. Very, very capable, but obviously only 5. So at that level, you think one of the issues that you might, in a NATO context, want to address is providing more capacity and capability in that area, either through more RQ-4s, or you supplement the RQ-4 with a smaller, potentially a smaller UAV, or however you want to do it, and also more geospatial. In terms of tracking tells, very little to almost nothing in the public domain in this. I would imagine it's an opportunity that the alliance has taken on board, along with a lot of other areas. It's an area for intelligence gathering and performance on threat systems. And I think that there will be, undoubtedly considerable amount of analysis going on, both on the alliance side, but obviously also in Moscow as well. Camille?
No, just to strengthen Duke's point, I think, first of all, I left NATO, where I was in charge of that about a year ago. So I should caveat my comments by saying it's more my personal comment, because obviously that large portion of that conversation will be a classified conversation, and rightly so. But I think in terms of lessons learned for the alliance, I would indeed stress the C4ISR capabilities, because one of the lessons is that finding missiles, tracking missiles is extremely demanding, and we do have some tools for that, but we need to have better tools. So everything that from space assets to unmanned assets to airborne surveillance that enables to have a better tracking is really critical. And indeed, the AGS capability has proven quite valuable in this conflict, even though a number of allies were sort of doubting the value of such high-end capabilities when the contract was launched. As a reminder, France and the UK are not part to the program for that reason. The second point is really real-time command and control systems. That is really, really something that is very demanding, and we need to move forward on this. So there is a whole process at NATO on the digitalization of the battlefield, of the NATO command structure. And I think that is really going to be one of the key lessons learned, and we need to understand how where the Ukrainians very good, where they were more, where we could probably do better. And finally, in terms of effectors, I think the fact that in terms of air and missile defense, we need to have a more diverse range of effectors, from the Gepard, so ground-to-air artillery, to very high-end capable missiles, is, I think, an important point if you want to draw lessons there, because you obviously will not want to, as much as possible, fire very expensive assets against very cheap targets there, unless you really have to.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running out of time. I'm just going to ask one last question. If you could just make your answers succinct, that would be fantastic. What is your assessment of where European NATO allies are in the process of assessing and understanding the right balance between offense and defense in the region in this new change security environment? And what is the most important thing to achieve cohesion on that matter?
With the caveat I had previously about the nature of the conversation, I would say not far enough. From my understanding, I think we need to go much deeper into this conversation. And again, I would stress the point I made in my initial presentation by not with a starting point, which would be, we will not do this, we will not do that, but to really be able to think out of the box and then decide what are the most appropriate decision to address the new environment.
Thank you very much. Doug, anything to add?
Just to support that, just to say absolutely, a clean sheet of paper approach without any preconceptions as to where the balance should lie between those two, and to really get to grips with the issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our two speakers, and thank you also to the audience for your fantastic questions. This was really a rich conversation, and it really shows that a lot of work is being already done, a lot of lessons are being learned, but there's plenty in front of us. We will have more of MDI webinars, which we will be announcing very soon. In the meantime, I invite you to read our recent research papers on our website. Thank you very much once again for tuning in today, and have a good rest of the day.